Yeah, I'd like to give you a presentation, say your title. Many thanks for being here.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Raphael, for organizing this. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting conference, and the whole series, I think, has been really interesting. As a Browning advisee, and I don't say former because and Chris is here, so he might be embarrassed, but Chris is the kind of advisor who is happy to sort of keep helping you even when you're a grown up. So as a Browning advisee, I of course, very interested to be invited here to speak, and also I'm in kind of an interesting position. And so I know Chris is in the audience, so I hope that I will accurately sort of represent his approach. And I've obviously been, very much influenced by his work and methodology, but I've also, I think, moved in some different directions, as we all have to, right? And I'm also really fortunate that Raphael was kind enough to share with me some areas for discussion that he thought might be interesting based on some of the things that I've done. And so as a result, I think this presentation might be a bit eclectic, but I think and I hope that it will all come together in the end. So I want to start with a quote from the great Holocaust historian, Raoul Hilberg, that I think sums up both Browning's and certainly my approach to this history. Certainly for me, I think the big answers come from small questions, to sort of put this in a reverse formulation. That is, when we look at how things like the Holocaust actually played out on the ground, where individuals meet individuals and where physical behaviors have to take place, I think that's where we can learn the most about both human nature and the forces that made the Holocaust possible. So ultimately, this talk is really about how can we take Browning's work as a starting point for innovation and for new ways of thinking about the Holocaust. So I want to start by talking a little bit about Browning's approach and how it fits into our understanding of perpetrator behavior. Next, I want to suggest perhaps how we can move beyond the conceptual analysis of the perpetrator-victim bystander paradigm. And finally, I want to show some of the new ways of thinking about perpetrators that I have found helpful in my own work. And what I'm really looking forward to, which is something that I'm always looking forward to the most in these kinds of presentations, is our discussion later and the questions that you guys might have, or comments or critiques. So to this end, I want to offer several avenues that hopefully we can engage with, and you can sort of choose your own adventure in that sense. So with apologies to those who are already deeply familiar with Browning's work, especially Ordinary Men, I just wanted to give kind of a brief overview here of how the field has evolved over time, or how I see it as having evolved over time. And I think this will help to situate the later discussion. So when Ordinary Men was published in 1992, it represented, I think, a very powerful entry into an existing debate in historiography between the so-called intentionalists and functionalists. At its highest level, this historical argument centered around explanations for how and why the Holocaust took place, specifically the phase that included the mass murder of the Jews. Intentionalists argued that the Nazis intended from the beginning to solve the so-called Jewish question by killing all Jews, and they supported this contention by relying heavily on Hitler as a driver of policy, using his own anti-Semitism as proof of his intentions. Functionalists, on the other hand, argued that the mass killings of Jews stemmed from initiatives of subordinates reacting to a variety of pressures within the Byzantine system of Nazi government. And they contended there were a series of moments or choices that eventually led to the gas chambers. And so when Daniel Goldhagen's now infamous book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, appeared in 1996, it represented the application of the intentionalist perspective to the issue of perpetrator motivation. So I sort of take this chart that I've created and reformulate it as it relates to Browning and Goldhagen here. So both Browning and Goldhagen sought to explain not so much the high-level decisions for genocide, at least in these books, but rather why the perpetrators behaved as they did. Thus, the intentionalist functionalist debate was now reflected in perpetrator studies. For Goldhagen, the perpetrators were motivated by a uniquely virulent eliminationist anti-Semitism. Representing the functionalist perspective, Browning suggested instead that the killers were primarily driven by situational factors and socio-psychological pressures. But ultimately, both were trying to describe the relationship between what we do, what we believe, and what we experience. And so while both approaches were somewhat monocausal in their own ways, though I'd argue that Goldhagen's is much more monocausal than Browning's, Goldhagen's reliance on a unique, particularly German desire to kill Jews was not particularly convincing, not least because of its cherry picking of evidence and sloppy argumentation. Browning's approach, on the other hand, offered a new perspective and one that introduced a reliance on introducing social psychology, as a methodological tool. And this approach reflects the fact that the vast majority of perpetrators were not sociopaths or clinically ill. I think one of the things that makes the use of social psychology appealing is the fundamental difficulty in working with motivation. Much of perpetrator studies revolves around why rather than what. That is, the emphasis is often on understanding why these people did what they did. This, in any historical context, I would argue, can be a very fraught endeavor. We're often unable to put the perpetrators on the couch, so to speak. Moreover, ego documents are rare for the killers, and when they exist, they must be used very carefully. And incidentally, one of the things that Browning did so well was to build a framework for reading very problematic perpetrator texts. Our starting point, I would argue, for investigating perpetrators is their actions, particularly in the absence of insight into their mindsets. By placing the actions of the policemen in Reserve Police Battalion 101 in the context of social psychological theory, I think Browning was able to present a more compelling argument. However, whichever approach one finds convincing, I think both Goldhagen and Browning were arguing for the primacy of one explanation. Our behavior is either the result of what we believe, or it is the result of situational and social pressures. And I'm simplifying here, obviously, sort of for the purposes of this discussion. And I think that our understanding and approach to the pivotal issue of perpetrator motivation has become more complex and nuanced in recent scholarship. So if I go to my next sort of image here, so this is where we sort of were probably 20 years ago or so, arguing about sort of these two influencers, if you will, to our behaviors. And so first, I think the need for a monocausal explanation seems to have dissipated. And here you sort of have kind of the Aristotelian synthesis, antithesis, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of thing. In order to get where we are today, we had to sort of have these two poles identified. And secondly, I think what we've recognized is that the pathways of influence go both ways. What we do influences what we believe just as much as what we believe influences what we do. In the same vein, situational and social factors are not static, but change depending on our behavior. So to make this more complex, we see that the loop begins to feed back in both directions. And then finally, we sort of complete the circle with all of these things working together. Thus, and I think Browning would actually, I think Chris would agree with me here. What we're looking at now is perpetrator motivation on a spectrum that is variable over time and space. If the fundamental tension is between ideology and social factors, then I would argue we are now more interested in the relative weight of each together in any given situation. And this formulation calls for a much more complex approach that looks at how all of these variables come into play simultaneously at a specific moment in time, which is how I think this work is best done. And so here again, I got really fancy with my illustrations here. We sort of have, if we're thinking about the two poles are ideology and social psychological situation factors, then where we are now is looking at, okay, where do these overlap in one place and in one time? And then that is how we characterize the behaviors or the motivations at that particular point in time. And I think that therefore it allows people to move back and forth between motivations, and then we'll see in a minute, even sort of behaviors. So this discussion of spectrums rather than monocausal explanations leads me to what I think is my fundamental critique of perpetrator studies writ large. And that's this paradigm of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, which has been around for a very long time. And the more I research and the more I work with this stuff, the more troubled I am by the conceptual paradigm of the perpetrator, victim, and bystander. First, while this formulation may be thought to simply categorize general positions of individuals in the Holocaust, I think it's more often used as a taxonomy of behavior. My discomfort grew out of my research into German soldiers, as well as a general feeling that a bystander implies perfect neutrality, which I simply don't find intellectually convincing. We all have opinions on just about everything, from important things to meaningless ones. For example, if I ask everyone here today whether they prefer Coke or Pepsi, I suspect you all have an answer to that, and it may be a strongly held answer, right? And so we take something as trivial as that and then think about something like genocide. I think it's fair to say that everyone could not remain without a particular position one way or the other. Put another way, to echo the great historian of American history, Howard Zinn, you can't be neutral on a moving train. And what I mean by that is that acting or failing to act are both choices with meanings. So they're both positive actions. You're doing something. I think the paradigm itself is also logically flawed in that it compares unlike things. Perpetrators and bystanders, whatever that means, are engaged in some form of behavior that characterizes them as such, while victims are, in some sense, characterized by actions outside of their control. And so I kind of am thinking now about a bystander-less world. I would remove victims from this model completely and replace them with resistors, or as something that Browning sort of mentioned earlier as evaders, right? Or as mentioned of his work. And I think this adjustment and removal of the category of bystander allows us to engage with actors in a much more complex manner. So let me give you an example. If we have someone who's observing a pogrom against Jews in Poland, they can't be a bystander. What do I mean by that? If they remain and or express their approval, they are on the perpetrator side, as they're providing an approving audience, which serves to encourage the abuse. They're not to the same level as someone that's doing the killing or the abuse, but they're not neutral. Conversely, if they throw up their hands in disgust and leave, they are in some small way resisting, not substantially to be sure, but also they are not neutral. One of the advantages of this approach, I think, is that it is predicated on observable behavior, at least in some sense, separate from motivation. And so you get, this kind of scenario where at a particular moment in time, a person can be characterized as at some end or at some place on the spectrum, right? But they can certainly move back and forth, depending, again, on the situation, on the time, and all these other characteristics and factors that we've already talked about. Naturally, we would like to know why someone behaved the way they did, but it is the behavior fundamentally that counts. So for me, I begin with actions and then try to understand motive if possible. Looking at behavior this way, I think also allows the same person to inhabit different points along the spectrum based on shifting beliefs and situations. And we see that quite a lot. And I think this is one of the things that is important to do, is to always make things more complex and allow for more nuance in our understandings, which is something that Chris does in Ordinary Men, certainly, by sort of being able to delineate people who are in certain groups at certain times. So I want to shift a little bit now to some of the ways that we've built on Chris's work and move beyond his critical intervention in Ordinary Men. And the first, I think, has to do with the very nature of so-called perpetrator studies. I think one criticism of Ordinary Men, which is in some sense fair and in some sense unfair, is that it's a Holocaust history without the victims. And of course, there are very reasonable explanations for this, for the relative lack of Jewish voices and perspectives in this. So I'm not building a straw man to sort of tear down here. One, of course, is that Chris was focused on explaining perpetrator behavior, and in that sense, a reliance on looking at perpetrators is fully to be expected. In addition, the sources that he could use to best explain that were primarily perpetrator-based ego documents and sources. And of course, we have the very real historical challenge of the fact that very few of those Jews that would have been witnesses, particularly to the shooting operations, survived. So there's already a dearth of potential perspectives from the other side. Still, I think if we're thinking about perpetrators, I've always found it slightly uncomfortable to abandon the victim perspective altogether. And Saul Friedlander pointed out this dilemma when he called for an integrative and integrated history of the Holocaust. And incidentally, I think it in some ways, certainly Chris has come to the conclusion as well, without putting words in his mouth. But if you take his really great book on Strachowitz, Remembering Survival, in that book, he very much incorporates Jewish perspectives along with carrying forward, I think, a lot of the things he did in Ordinary Men in terms of analyzing perpetrators' behavior and that kind of thing. So I think, we're all sort of moving in this direction. And of course, that book was also just as much about the nature of testimony itself and what kinds of testimonies we can use to understand particular events. As my own research has progressed, I've come to the conclusion, I think, that when we're studying perpetrators, we're often studying the relationships between individuals. And I'm going to keep coming back to this in this discussion. After all, genocide cannot occur without interactions between humans. Writing in 2009, Chris himself noted approvingly that Friedlander sought to, quote, uncover the interaction of Jews and perpetrators at the micro level, end quote, which I think I certainly try to do as well. As such, it seems to me that we cannot fully understand perpetrators when they are examined in isolation from their interaction with victims, collaborators, and others. And this, I think, has to go beyond simply including Jewish voices as well. And one could potentially critique Friedlander a little bit here as well, in the sense that Jewish voices should not just be illustrations as we're doing this. And obviously, I think it's acceptable and important to focus scholarly study on the perpetrators. So I'm not negating that at all. But I also think it's really critical to consider how situation and other actors influenced perpetrator mindset and behavior. And certainly some of those actors are the victims and are the people that we might put in that problematic bystander category. And of course, we are certainly limited by our sources and by the nature of the events that we're studying to the extent to which we can do that. So I hope I'm not being overly critical or unfair in that sense. So I'd like to shift a little bit now, and I think present some of the ways that we can take Browning's socio-psychological intervention, and I would argue his early embrace of interdisciplinarity a little bit further. And so in conversations with Chris, he's often referred to research as choosing the right methodology from the toolbox. And I think it certainly chimes with me, and it's precisely the way that I think about the act of doing history. And I would say that he is not wedded to being any particular type of historian or doctrinaire of any kind of particular methodology. He prefers to use whichever approach is most useful and most effective based on the subject that he's working on. And I too hope that I'm in that boat as well. I think that's often the most effective way of doing things. And I think we already see this in his early reliance on a social psychological lens at a time when I think such interdisciplinary perspectives were not as common. And I think it's one of the things that makes Ordinary Men such an extraordinary book, because he's introduced for a whole generation of scholars, I think, and certainly for me personally, an intellectual curiosity to reach out to other disciplines and other approaches. And so taking Browning's acceptance of new methodologies as a starting point, then, I'd like to share a couple new directions in perpetrator studies that I think we all should consider. And these are social network analysis and digital modeling. Both are digital humanities approaches, and both rely on incorporating an understanding of space in our work. As Holocaust scholar Paul Jascott has written, quote, "A true integrated history of the Holocaust that works towards a total understanding of the event must by definition be a relational one," end quote. And relational here, I would suggest, can mean both in connections between people and between people and spaces, or people and places. And so the examples I'm going to use now moving forward for the rest of this presentation are from my most recent research, which is on the Janovska concentration camp, which is currently, or was located in Lviv, Ukraine. And I've just finished a manuscript on that I'm working through the publication process of it. So let me do a brief introduction just to the history of this camp, so you have a little bit of background before I look at the two new directions that I've mentioned. Let's see. I didn't include that slide. Okay, no worries. So basically, the Janovska camp was located in Lviv. It's very interesting because it's an urban camp. So it is about 20 minutes walk from downtown. It was established in 1941 as part of the Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke. And then later on, a separate but related camp was built literally next door, which was run by the higher SS and police leader in Lviv, a guy by the name of Friedrich Katzmann. What makes Janovska really interesting for me, and perhaps unique in its own way, is that it functioned as a hybrid camp for its entire existence, which is to say that it served the function of being a forced labor camp with all the things that entails, role in the local economy and that kind of thing. It also served as a transit camp for most of the Jews in District Galician. So around 400,000 or so potentially passed through the camp on their way to Belzec in some way, shape, or form. Certainly the majority of the Jews in the city of Lviv passed through the camp. And throughout its entire existence, it served as a dedicated killing site. And the numbers are quite extraordinary, really. Thomas Sandkuhler has estimated that as many as perhaps 80,000 Jews were murdered on the grounds of the camp itself. If that's true, and I think there's good reason to suggest that it is, then Janovska killed more Jews than Majdanek, and killed more Jews than Dachau, Buchenwald, and Belsen put together, et cetera, et cetera. And so it really elevates it, certainly numerically, into the upper ranks of killing centers, right? It's not an extermination center in the Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor sort of taxonomy, but it is a very important space. And this is something that unlike Majdanek, it wasn't sporadic. It took place over the entire course of the camp's history. The camp also was home to basically the training center for the Sonderkommando 1005 detail, the one that was responsible for digging up and destroying the remains of Jews after many of the killing operations taken place. That was hosted there, where SS men would come to learn how to do that. The camp also witnessed 2 successful uprisings and escapes, mass escapes, which is also a really interesting phenomenon. And there's a really rich amount of source material, which I'm going to show a little bit later, that allows us to work with this. And so you can imagine, from a certain perspective, my surprise when I realized that there wasn't really any historical work per se done on this. Thomas Sandkuhler has a chapter. There are sort of mentions here and there, but no sort of scholarly piece on this, despite the fact that we have lots of testimony, several memoirs. Simon Wiesenthal was a prisoner in Janowska for a brief period of time. And so, I think it's a place whose time has come. And the site itself is now mostly still a prison, inaccessible to the public, because it's now a Ukrainian prison. Okay, so with that introduction, let me move to the issue of social networks. This is a concept that has been used in social science research for some time, but for some reason, and I'm not really quite sure why, it's yet to be really accepted in Holocaust studies. And here we have, the sort of mandatory quote from the play and then the film 6 Degrees of Separation, the idea that we're all connected, in actually quite surprisingly small ways. And this is in fact what we're trying to accomplish when we do a social network analysis. What do we learn about perpetrators, for example, if we place them in their social and geographical relational contexts? Social network analysis allows us then to take large amounts of data and uncover relationships and patterns that may be hidden in the mass of historical evidence. And as pioneering mathematician John Tukey wrote 45 years ago, quote, "The greatest value of a picture," and in this sense, he's talking about a visualization, right? A mapping, the actual social network diagram. "The greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to notice what we never expected to see," end quote. And I think this is what I find so intriguing about it. A social network approach views people as connected in a variety of ways. They exchange ideas, they share experiences, they give and receive orders, they disseminate practices. Put another way, as a famous German sociologist wrote about 150 years ago, "Tell me who you deal with, and I will tell you who you are." Simply mapping the origins of the Enoskagars, for example, yields a surprising number of ethnic Germans who all came from the Banat region in what is now Serbia. More than a few guards lived near each other, and some had certainly known each other before the war. And as an interesting aside, which you can probably guess from the quote here, while he is best known for his obedience experiments, Stanley Milgram was also a pioneering investigator into social networks, which he did with a letter writing experiment. So I want to give you an example of this by looking at one guard in particular, a guy named Adolf Kalanko. When Adolf Kalanko arrived in Janowska at the head of a group of men from the infamous Travniki training camp on 27 January 1942, he carried with him a surprising collection of prior experience and relationships in that strange fraternity of Holocaust perpetrators. An ethnic German born in 1908 in Upper Silesia, in what is now Racibórz, Poland, Adolf joined the SS in 1933, and in August 1939 was called to Berlin. In an exemplary Bauhaus complex in the Bernau suburbs, he attended a 2-week course of military training at the SD school there. While it's not clear precisely what his training entailed, The SD school at Bernau could count as its graduates the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen killing squads shortly before Kalanko's arrival, and Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. While multiple courses for a variety of officials were offered, the whole place served as a pedagogical initiation into the Nazi war against the Jews. Many murderers of Jews passed through its doors as instructor or student. Among those there that August was Josef Gerzemek. Gerzemek was the son of a slaughterhouse worker who grew up only 20 miles away from Kalanko in Silesia. His training prepared him for the false flag attacks on Polish sites that provided the pretext for the start of the war. Gerzemek would go on to command multiple concentration camps in District Galician, including the Lviv ghetto remnant known as the Gulag, and he would later march survivors from the Płażów camp to Auschwitz. Kalanko left Berlin for Częstochowa, Poland, where he served as a paramilitary. There, he overlapped with two future Janowska men, Paul Fox and Hans Sobota. Leaving Częstochowa, Kalanko headed for the city of Radom. There, he was a personal guard, i.e. standing outside the door, of the SS and police leader there, the man who established the Radom ghetto and who would go on to create the Lviv ghetto, Friedrich Katzmann. Before training Volksdeutsche paramilitaries in Lublin in late 1940, Kalanko helped establish a slave labor camp in Biała Podlaska, along with 4 other future Janowska men. His next major assignment saw him stationed at the Travniki camp as a trainer. Kalanko then arrived in Lviv with new guards for Janowska from that camp, likely men that he himself had trained. Once in the camp, he was reunited with an acquaintance from his pre-war job in a Siemens factory, another SS guard in the camp. Kalanko would graduate from his supervisor duty in Janowska to command his own camp in Grodek Jagiellonski before returning to Janowska after his command's liquidation. A close examination of the SS men in the camp, therefore, reveals that a surprising number of them also walked similar paths and encountered future colleagues as Kalanko did. And there may be more connections that have been lost to time, just based on sources. In my work on this project, I pieced together the life trajectories of 78 guards, which yielded over 400 separate identifiable locations. Using a network software called Gephi, we can then place all of these trajectories in conversation with each other and begin to see connections. One of the interesting takeaways from this research is that a large number of these men knew each other quite well before ending up in Janowska. And here you see one visualization of it. All of the green circles are people, all of the blue circles are locations. And you can start to see how people share different places, have had different experiences, they're overlapping. One of the, I think, interesting insights is the ability then to plot their experience in the Holocaust before they arrived in the camp. And so building a comprehensive social network that includes both pre and post camp service also yields some important insights. For example, many of the guards from Janowska left the camp to command or serve in other ghettos and camps. And here's just a slice of those people. And this, you don't have to read all of them, but the point is that these people sort of shot out from Janowska and went to lots of different places. But again, they're with people that they sort of knew beforehand. And then afterwards, after these camps are liquidated, many of them return back to Janowska. And so there's lots of different insights that we can think about or questions to be asked. What does it mean that they knew each other? Did they develop friendships? How did these relationships impact their behavior? Did they develop enemies? Because some of them did. Some of them had rivals and they were trying to impress them and things like this. And again, note that circling back to my emphasis on actions and sort of things you can grab a hold of first, this is all based primarily on biographical data, places that we knew they were from their life trajectories. and from their biographies. Okay, so I want to close then with a spatial approach. And what does a spatial approach mean? And I think this takes two forms. One builds off Browning's innovative methodology in using problematic perpetrator sources. In other words, how can we use spatial documents and spatial witnessing to uncover or inform our historical analysis? And the second form is that of thinking more theoretically about how we can use an investigation into space and place to better understand historical events. Both approaches, as I use them, employ digital tools. In this case, mapping and what we call an HBIM, or historical building information modeling, which is just a fancy way of saying the 3D reconstruction of spaces based on photogrammetry, photos, drawings, and other sources. And in a theoretical sense, it's just important, I think, to emphasize that place and spatial and geographical memory is written into almost every source we have about the Holocaust, whether it's from survivors or perpetrators. We always connect our histories with the places that they took place in. That's how we remember things. And also, even in the moment, the meanings of places were critical for survival, for prisoners, for victims, for inmates, as well as for the perpetrators. And so being able to understand and know the environment in which one functioned, I think, is a fundamental piece of understanding behavior of both perpetrators and victims and everyone in between, right? And so I think one of the things that this is helpful for us is that because we encode space in our memories, a lot of our testimonies and sources have in them the data to do these kinds of spatial analyses. So let me start with a short discussion of what I did, give you one example, and then of sort of the how we can use a variety of spatial sources to build maps and use and build tools that help us interrogate perpetrator behavior. And then a little bit later, towards the end, what we can do with some 3D modeling. So this is kind of the show and tell portion, I suppose, of the discussion. So I mentioned sources. We can use, there are a lot of sources for Janowska and lots of other places that have spatial data in them that we can use to build a map or build a model. And these are just some examples specific to Janowska. And I will draw attention here to the survivor drawings at the bottom. I'm going to use those fairly rigorously. This is a map drawn by a survivor after the war that was used in some of the trial work. And here you have an example of how good this map is. On the right, you see an aerial photograph of the camp taken during the war in 1944 by the Luftwaffe. And if you look, you can sort of see very clearly how these things match up. And so we have some really good information about what these particular buildings were. And it's quite rare to have this kind of photograph of a camp while in operation, certainly in the East, for sure. And by taking lots of sources together, don't worry about not being able to read the locations here. One can then begin to identify on this image what buildings are which. So I'm going to really quickly show what this leads to. And I know I have a little bit of time left, so let me share. Using all the sources that I just mentioned, we can then begin to create a map and a model. And so what you're seeing right now is basically what you get from Google Earth. It's using a software called ArcGIS. What we can first do then is overlay that aerial photograph, but in a way that is geo-rectified, meaning that every place on the ground is accurate to what is shown on the image. You can see this here, it's already 3D. So you can see how the hills behind the camp are now in a three-dimensional format. And then I simply added on the buildings that and the fence lines that we know, right? And you can do something really interesting just with this particular image. And so I'm gonna now, I'll drop this in the chat. So if anybody wants to play around with it on their own, you can do that. And I'm going to go back to my presentation here. So just to give you an example of what you can do, we have this photograph, which was taken in the camp. And I was interested in where this was taken, because it clearly shows perpetrators with family members, having a good time, having a party in a garden. And I was interested in trying to find out where this was taken. Here's another photograph from the same series. And you notice in the background, there's this building with the laundry line, and you notice it's elevated, right? There's this retaining wall. And I was curious, where is this photograph taken? Because I think that will tell us something about perpetrators. So again, here we have the aerial photograph of the camp that helps me sort of begin to narrow it down. And then this is particularly interesting. This is a map drawn by the commandant in the post-war period. And you'll notice that he's indicated over here a garden and also an eating room and a kitchen for the staff. So I thought, okay, this might be it. And if this is it, then how do we situate that spatially in the context of the camp? Again, zooming in, that area is roughly here. And then if we zoom in on his actual commentary on the map, he notes that these buildings here are barracks, and here lived 12 women, which were Jews, i.e. inmates, which then would argue that this location is directly almost in the camp itself. So these people are having this party literally in the middle of a concentration camp. But how do we prove that? One of the things that's really neat that you can do with the software is you can draw a line from a place to another place. And here we have the garden that I mentioned, and it shows the change in elevation. So this point is actually 3.5 meters higher than this point, which is where the photograph, I think, was taken, which then, of course, corresponds to this piece. So that's the elevation, that's the barracks. So we know that they're having this party in the camp, literally a stone's throw next to where the prisoners are living. Just as one example of what you can do with this. Okay, I'm going to finish by giving you a sneak peek into sort of what I'm doing now, which again is working at the three-dimensional level. What happens if we can actually reconstruct digitally the camp itself, which has lots of good reasons to do this, both analytically and from an accessibility perspective, because literally one cannot visit this camp, and a lot of it is destroyed anyway. So again, we take some of the same sources, and I'm going to show you just a proof of concept that we've been doing, which is roughly centered here. This is the gate into the inner portion of the camp. Here we have a sketch drawn by a survivor while he was in the camp, who was an architect. You see this guard shack here, which is this guard shack here. This is Adolf Kalanko, by the way, standing at the right side. And based on this and other photographs, we can begin to build a model. And so that's what we have here. And this is in progress, working with an architect friend of mine who can do this 3D modeling. We can begin to build this, recreate this scene. And this is obviously very important. Here you have again, a drawing from a survivor from the camp of 2 rabbis who are being persecuted, forced to dance on this particular platform. Now you might ask, why would we do this? Who cares? What's the point? What you can do with this is actually do a lot of things that I think are really useful in understanding perpetrators. One of them is perspective. So we can put a cursor up here and sort of see what in the camp would be visible from this particular perspective. So surveillance was very important. What areas could be seen and could not be seen by the guards? you can put lights on the guard towers and see what was dark and what was light at any given time. And then you can begin to sort of place the testimony of perpetrators and victims and survivors in context of the ground itself. Okay, so I want to just end with, again, a sort of a cool find, I suppose, that also I think really speaks to why space and location of perpetrators is important. So remember, I pointed out this shack here, right? And then I showed this image. Did anyone notice in the background this little girl? This little girl is the commandant's daughter. And so again, she is literally standing in the midst of the camp itself. You know, and so who is there with her? Maybe her mother, maybe the commandant. We don't know who this figure here is. But again, I think this just goes to show the importance of space. And I want to stop now before I go too far over my time. Thank you so much. And I look forward to your questions and comments.
Many thanks, Waitman. It was very, very interesting. And I'm sure there are many questions. So maybe if there are questions, you can write it in the chat. So we take them in order. You can just write a queue.
I'll just drop that image in there as well. I put it in the wrong things.
So if there are no questions, I had a question. So I find it very...
Someone has their hand up.
Sorry, I didn't see. Jan, please go ahead.
Okay, so thanks for your talk. But I think that is still one perspective which is usually overlooked, mainly statistical, because many behaviors were statistical simply, particularly by bystanders. On the other hand, almost every case of survivors can be very precisely described, because it was an individual case, and the number six person is very interesting, because according to estimations in Poland, to save one Jew was required action about 6-7 persons. I have no time to say something more. However, my own story, because I am a survivor in a sense, I was a child, but I know something from stories of my relatives, even not my mother, who was completely silent. And we were very lucky because we were not, was an assimilated family and Catholic, so we were not so in danger as real Jews. However, of course, we were also be included by Germans into victims. So I can very exactly say what happens. So many accidents decide about our life. For example, you mentioned Radom. I was born in Radom. And so I know something about it. But anyway, the statistical perspective seems to me very important, and it is very overlooked. For example, in general governing, there were, let's say, 10 millions of Poles living and confronted, in a sense, directly or indirectly, with Holocaust. And you cannot say that an exact number of people collaborated with only a statistical minority, 10%, 15%. The same is as far as the issue concerns people who help Jews. But the most were simply neutral. And Germans knew that, of course, and they relied that, okay, so people in Europe will not act against our plans. So I think that these two perspectives, intentionalist and functional, as you say, are a little bit simplified because it's changed. Certainly Germans had the intention to make Europe free of Jews. However, the situation changed. For example, it is clear from documents about Wannsee conference. It shows how the situation changed. Madagascar plan was over, also invasion for Soviet Union and so on. So difficult to draw a very general.
Other questions. So.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I will say one thing. I appreciate the comment. Thank you so much. The one area that I have that I know that, for example, Natalia Alexion is working in this area. In areas of rescue, there are the social network analysis work has gone further with people looking at who all is involved in rescuing. For example, as you say, usually one person required multiple individuals in that. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I think the next was Chris. We don't hear you.
Christopher, maybe.
I think you're muted, Chris.
Yeah, we don't hear you.
Chris, I think you're muted.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Thanks so much, Waitman. And I just want to sort of expand very briefly on a couple of points that you made. First was the sort of the binary situation versus ideology framework in which my book and Goldhagen's book were placed initially. I had always intended my book to be more multi-causal, but once he staked out a sort of militant monocausal argument on the one hand, my book got put in the other corner. I think over-exaggerating the degree to which it was, quote, the situational explanation. And I think the person who perhaps articulated this most importantly was the social psychologist Leonard Newman, who in response to Goldhagen book pointed out that in fact situations are not neutral. Situations are interpreted by the people that are in them. They're constructed and read by the people in them. And they do that through the cultural lenses they're wearing, through the assumptions they bring, so that in fact a situation is ideologically shaped. It is culturally shaped. And that situation and ideology then are intertwined and cannot be separated. And I think I wasn't smart enough to figure that out, but I'm glad that he, a few years later, kind of articulated that to help us get beyond that false binary of a situational versus an ideological explanation. Certainly one of the responses I got, particularly from Israeli colleagues about Ordinary Men, was that it didn't, of course, use Jewish sources. I responded to that in two ways. The first was, that's not entirely true. I could not have recreated the itinerary of the battalion without Jewish evidence. The fact was that for the men themselves, everything became a blur after the first summer. By fall, one massacre blended into another. They couldn't recreate their itinerary. They couldn't recreate the dates on which things happened. But people who survived knew exactly the day that battalion arrived in their town and murdered their family. Now, they survived because they hid and never saw the Germans. They can't tell us about German motivation, but they can tell us about when certain things happened. And so the book, in fact, I couldn't have recreated the chronology and the geography without survivor testimony. But as I say, that doesn't address the issue of differentiating between the Germans. Now, the situation for remembering survival, where the Germans and the Jewish victims are in the same camp, living in effect together for 27 months, then I can do that. And I noted while I had created a kind of tripartite division of eager killers, accommodators, and evaders in terms of the battalion, the language the Jewish survivors of Strakovica used was the dangerous Germans, the ones you always avoided because they killed Jews whenever they could, the corrupt Germans, the Germans you could make deals with, who were there to enrich themselves personally, as well as the factory exploiting labor. They didn't want to get left out. And then the small number of, quote, decent Germans, ones that actually they could get help from in dire circumstances. So there was, again, a three-way division in the eyes of the victims of the Germans, and they needed to know those differences to survive. Part of surviving was knowing the difference between Germans and distinguishing those. So I think that while I couldn't do that through ordinary men, the notion that the Germans are not monolithic, and in fact, it was very important to understand the differences, came out through the victim perspective in remembering survival. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's that. And for those of you that haven't read the afterword that Chris wrote in the 25-year anniversary, I suppose, edition of Ordinary Men, that's a really useful addition to the book, because Chris lays out many things in a lot of detail that he just talked about, in terms of, Leonard Newman and Harold Walzer and all these people that have done more things, and have sort of taken what Chris did. And I would just add that, I think that the spatial approach, at least in the camp, speaks precisely in a different sense to what Chris just mentioned in terms of needing what you needed to know to survive in the camp. For example, in Janovska, one of the things that the commandant liked to do was sit on the balcony of his villa and shoot prisoners as they walked around the camp. And so you literally have prisoners in there, or survivors in their testimony, talking about how they knew they had to plan their route around the camp in such a way that they were hidden from sight from the villa, because they knew that was a dangerous space. Same thing with, the latrines were dangerous spaces for prisoners at certain times. So during the day, they were a safe space where prisoners could go and conduct trade and communicate with each other, et cetera, et cetera. But at night, the guards would sort of hide and try to catch anybody going to the latrine at night and often kill them. So it's actually dovetails really nicely with what Chris was talking about in terms of knowing the Germans and who was safe and who wasn't, as also knowing the terrain itself. So the terrain itself, I would argue, is not neutral either. The geography of the camp itself, there were places of safety, places of bribery, places of danger. So that's a really interesting perspective. So thanks, Chris. I hope I didn't mangle your perspective too much in my conversation.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, Marie, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Waitman, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm very interested in your spatial analysis, and I'm just wondering if you went there in Lviv to see the site, because from the cemetery, it's possible, from the hill, it's possible to see the structure of the camp. And my question was, you talk about 80,000 victims killed in Janovska. So you mean killed on the spot, on the site of the camp, or in the Lysinichi forest or other sites around the town?
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's a really good question. I have been there, and I have been to Lysinichi forest as well. And it's so part of that DAW side of the camp is actually a housing estate. And so, for example, the headquarters building still exists. People are living in it today. So you can actually see the headquarters building. Most of the terrain that is now the Ukrainian prison, just based on overlaying the satellite, or I always say satellite, the aerial photograph and the current topology, it looks like most of the buildings have been destroyed there and replaced by different things. As far as the 80,000 number, so in the book, I should have had this to hand. I don't have it to hand. That 80,000 is based on killings that take place in the camp itself.
Okay.
There are a series of lots of them that take place. I think I did include some of the killings in the Lysinichi forest because they're done by the camp, basically by the camp administration. But you can take, there are a series of killings that are remembered by survivors, and then
you mean shot?
Shot, yes. in the ravines behind the camp.
Okay.
And so you can sort of, you can do that. And you can also take, the number of deportations from Lviv, the, excuse me, the original population was around 160,000 Jews. So by doing process of elimination, excuse me, you can also begin to sort of, in the book, I have sort of a high and a low number, and I think the high and low number was something like 50 to 80, depending, right? Because you also have, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos is often quite helpful too, because it says X number of Jews deported from small town in Galicia to Janowska to be killed, right? So you can begin to add up that way. And then again, as I said, the 80,000 number in particular comes from Thomas Sandkuhler. He's the one sort of came up with that one. So yeah, it's a guesstimate.
Have you found the ravine? Have you found the ravine on the aerial map?
I'm sorry?
The ravine.
Yeah. So the ravines, I mean, if you look, if you click on the map in the chat, you can just see based on the terrain. I mean, there's more than one site, right? So there are the multiple ravines behind the camp. There is a killing site behind the kitchen, which is a sort of open area. Then there's also what is now where the memorial is now, where the lake was also a killing site. So there are lots of little ones, but they're all basically within the environment of the camp.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe one last quick question from Isabel.
Yes, I will try to be brief. Well, thank you. It was really, really very, very interesting. I have a question. You said that you studied the social network of the camp guards. Did you also consider starting from one place where there were several of them? Who is the vicinity? I mean, were there future victims from the camp who were from this location, or what was the future of the people who were living with them in this town or village after, during and after, maybe after the war? For the background is I studied the region of Prijedor in Bosnia, and you can see that the previous relationship, the people were, most of them, like in Ormazka, the guards and the killers were from the same town or city as most of the victims, and the previous relations before the war had direct impact on the type of relation they had during the. So could you see that or not at all?
Thank you so much for your question. It's a really fascinating one. I think I only have a few sort of anecdotal evidence. So for example, there's a guy named Rakita who was a jazz musician in Katowice before the war, and he recognized a famous Jewish musician who was brought into the camp at some point and pulled him out and put him in the camp orchestra, for example. But I think one of the problems is that most of the guards they're not fundamentally local. And most of the prisoners are fundamentally local. It's not Auschwitz, right? So you don't have prisoners coming from long distances away. Most of them are coming from District Galician. Plus you have the problem of all of the upheaval in 1939 to 1941 of Jews fleeing different places and ending up in Lviv or fleeing Lviv, fleeing the Soviets and that kind of thing. So the short answer is I don't really think I have an intelligent comment. Certainly there were. And this is where you get to the interesting thing, though, of what happens when these men leave the camp, because they don't go very far. They go to camps and ghettos and work sites in Galicia, and oftentimes they come back with people that were prisoners in that camp or ghetto, and then ends up in Janowska. So I don't have any information about that, but certainly I think that's another interesting relationship of familiarity, right? Whatever that might mean. And then you have the most, and I'll be quiet, but the most blatant example is at the very end of the war, the last commandant of the camp, a guy named Wartzog, takes about 15 to 20 of the last remaining prisoners of the camp and creates this fake building, this building group, Baustab Venus, and uses them essentially as a shield for him and his SS men to not be called up for the front. And so he travels around Poland with this group of Jews, and they don't really do anything, but the Jews only exist to basically save him. So there's that interesting relationship too. But it's a great question. I don't have a really good answer to, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Waitman. Many thanks for the question. So a round of applause, and we can go, I think, without any pause because we took 5 minutes. We are 5 minutes late. So it's my pleasure to welcome Thomas Kühne. He's the author of The Rise and Fall of Comradeship on what he do. I will just let him present his views, and maybe you have a PowerPoint to share, Thomas, or not?
Raphael, thank you for including me in this conference. And no, I don't have a PowerPoint.
Okay.
This is a very traditional lecture or talk.
Okay.
Three remarks beforehand. My paper is titled Ordinary Men and Masculinity Gendering Holocaust Perpetrators. And I should say that I have used the term perpetrators in a very broad sense. If I were more precisely, I would probably say accomplices, and I don't like the term bystander either. But in a way, I support Waitman's elaborations on the problem of these allegedly clear categories such as perpetrator, bystander, and so on and so forth. Then the second thing I have to admit is that my paper is very empirical, not so much theoretical as Waitman's very instructive paper was. And thirdly, more